Here's the thing. If you were wondering how far the Supreme Court was willing to protect President Trump, we just got the answer, and it's worse than anyone expected. Because this immunity ruling, it didn't just tip the scales, it snapped them in half. It took the strongest criminal case the DOJ ever brought against a sitting or former president and overnight turned it into a cautionary tale about what happens when the judicial branch decides it's done pretending to be neutral. And the reaction inside the DOJ has been exactly what you think it is. Stunned, furious, and honestly terrified. Because this wasn't a legal clarification, this was a permission slip. Okay, hold on, because this is the part that people are just now beginning to understand. Jack Smith didn't lose because he didn't have the evidence. He didn't lose because the facts were weak. He didn't lose because the case was built poorly. He lost because 6 justices invented a standard that basically says if a president does something while in office, the courts are required to assume it's official until proven otherwise. And good luck proving otherwise when the very people who could testify are either pardoned, purged, or refusing to cooperate because they know exactly who signs their paychecks now, President Trump.
And yeah, this is wild, but the panic inside the DOJ didn't start when the ruling dropped. It started when Judge Aileen Cannon took that ruling and ran with it like it was a personal invitation to shut down the classified documents case entirely. She didn't question the evidence. She didn't dispute the charges. She just said Jack Smith was unconstitutionally appointed, declared the case invalid, and that was it. Done. A year of work, vaporized. And before anyone at DOJ could even process what happened, the Trump administration, now back in power, ordered the appeals dropped. The boxes seized from Mar-a-Lago returned to Trump. Yes, really. But here's the part nobody saw coming. The DOJ isn't just losing cases, they're losing people. Career prosecutors have been pushed out. Senior FBI officials replaced with loyalists. Pam Bondi installed as Attorney General. Kash Patel poised to run the FBI. And anyone who worked on January 6th or any Trump-related investigation has either resigned or been reassigned to make-believe offices with no phones, no staff, and no purpose. The message is obvious. The rules are different now. And yet, the most telling reaction didn't come from DOJ leadership or even Jack Smith's former team. It came from the people who have spent decades believing the system would hold no matter what. They're saying this ruling doesn't just protect President Trump. It effectively guarantees that a president who abuses his power can't be criminally prosecuted unless future courts voluntarily decide to limit the very power they just expanded. And if you're wondering why Trump is treating this ruling like a political victory lap, it's because he knows exactly what it means. The last real threat to him, Jack Smith, just ran out of floor. And the craziest part? We're only scratching the surface of what this actually unleashes.
Here's where this starts to get even more unbelievable, because once the Supreme Court handed down that immunity ruling, the DOJ didn't just lose the ability to prosecute Trump for actions tied to January 6th or the pressure campaign against state officials. They lost the foundation of Jack Smith's classified documents case, too. And remember, this was supposed to be the clean case. No complicated intent arguments, no executive privilege defenses, just a former president allegedly taking and hiding boxes of classified material, refusing to return them, directing aides to move them, and even talking about sensitive documents while cameras were rolling. This was the one case everyone said would stick until it didn't. And the collapse didn't happen slowly. It happened in one sentence from Judge Cannon, where she declared Jack Smith's appointment unconstitutional. She leaned heavily on Justice Thomas's concurrence, which was basically a neon sign flashing, "Please use this to blow up the case." Cannon didn't make a technical ruling. She issued a political judgment dressed up as constitutional theory, one that legal experts across the spectrum called absurd, baseless, and designed to insulate Trump from consequences. And the second that ruling hit, the DOJ realized the scoreboard had changed because appealing that decision would have meant fighting on a field where the refs already made it clear which team they were rooting for.
So what did the DOJ do? They dropped the appeal, at least as far as President Trump was concerned. And then, after he was sworn in for his second term, they dropped everything. Every remaining appeal. Every co-defendant case. Walt Nauta, Carlos de Oliveira, gone. The entire prosecution team, gutted, the evidence locked away, and for the final cherry on top, the very boxes seized from Mar-a-Lago, the ones containing classified documents mixed with golf shirts and random memorabilia, were returned to the president who had been accused of mishandling them in the first place. It's the closest thing you'll ever see in real life to a prosecutor building a case, presenting it, and then being ordered to hand the weapon back to the person they accused of using it improperly. And just when you think that's the whole story, it gets worse. Because President Trump didn't stop at dismantling the case. He dismantled the people behind it. Day one of his second term, he issued blanket pardons for nearly 1,600 January 6 defendants, about 1,500 full pardons, and a laundry list of commutations. That included members of the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, some of whom were convicted of seditious conspiracy. Judges who handled those cases expressed concern. Prosecutors who worked them for years were stunned. But for Trump, it was a message. Loyalty begets protection. And the corollary is obvious. Disloyalty leads to consequences.
And those consequences showed up fast. Career DOJ and FBI officials who worked on January 6th cases, Trump-related cases, or even tangentially came near the investigations were suddenly reassigned, sidelined, or pushed out. Attorney General Pam Bondi, installed by Trump, began what insiders quietly call a purge. Senior prosecutors who handled January 6 cases were removed from their roles. Others resigned after being reassigned to offices that didn't exist before. Offices with no staff, no phones, no responsibilities, and in some cases, not even a physical location. One attorney we learned about was reassigned to something called the Sanctuary Cities Compliance Office, which, according to multiple people familiar with the internal org chart, doesn't materially exist. It's a placeholder, a political broom closet. The FBI followed the same pattern. Acting Director Kash Patel, Trump's longtime loyalist, installed specifically because of his loyalty, began replacing bureau leadership, beginning with those who worked on the Russia investigation years ago and anyone who touched January 6th. It's not a subtle strategy. Trump made it very clear during his first term what he wanted: agents who were loyal to him personally. Now, in his second term, he's making sure that desire is no longer a request, it's a requirement. And as expected, the people who refused to play along, they're gone. But here's the part even insiders weren't expecting. At the same time Trump is dismantling the cases against himself, his DOJ is launching new investigations aimed at the same intelligence officials who concluded Russia interfered in 2016 to help him. More than 24 subpoenas were reportedly issued by the U.S. Attorney in Miami, Jason Reading Quinones, a Trump ally who, according to sources, was considered a low-rated line prosecutor before Trump elevated him. And what's he doing with his new authority? Reopening the same debates that congressional committees, independent investigations, and intelligence agencies settled years ago. Except this time, it's not about national security. It's about retribution.
And that's where the panic at DOJ isn't just emotional, it's structural. Because when prosecutors inside the building start seeing long-settled investigative conclusions being reopened for political purposes, they start asking what happens when the next president, any president, decides to use this moment as precedent. And the answer isn't good. The entire system is built on the idea that prosecutors investigate crimes, not enemies. Once you flip that logic, you don't get a functioning justice system. You get a political enforcement arm. I want to be really clear here because this is the thing that even some political commentators are glossing over. Jack Smith's cases didn't collapse because prosecutors got sloppy. They didn't collapse because evidence was missing. They didn't collapse because witnesses backed out. They collapsed because the rules changed mid-game. And once those rules changed, the DOJ had to decide whether to keep fighting in a system that was signaling it wouldn't allow accountability in the first place. And Trump's team knew this. That's why they pushed venue arguments. That's why they fought to keep Cannon. That's why they opposed any attempt to move the case to D.C., because they understood that one sympathetic judge, plus a Supreme Court leaning heavily in their direction, was a winning formula. And here's the twist nobody saw coming. Inside the DOJ, morale didn't just drop, it cratered. Former DOJ lawyers have started going on record describing unprecedented corruption inside Trump's second-term Justice Department. They talk openly about political case assignments, pressure to find wrongdoing among Trump critics, and the demoralizing effect of watching years of work on January 6th evaporate overnight. These aren't activists. These are career prosecutors who kept their heads down through 5 administrations and only started talking when they realized the system they believed in wasn't holding.
So the question now isn't whether Trump's immunity shield changed the legal landscape. It did. The question is how much further the DOJ collapse goes and whether anyone left inside the building has the ability or, frankly, the courage to stop it. And the answer to that is where things take a turn that almost no one saw coming. What happens next is where the entire situation goes from alarming to genuinely unprecedented. Because remember, this isn't just about one ruling or one case. It's about what that ruling enables. The immunity decision didn't simply place a shield around President Trump's past actions. It placed a shield around his current ones. And that is what career DOJ officials are terrified about, even if they won't say it publicly. They're not worried about the cases that already collapsed. They're worried about the cases that can't even be opened anymore, no matter how blatant the misconduct might be. And you can see exactly why that fear is justified by looking at how Trump reacted after the ruling. Because instead of saying, okay, the Supreme Court clarified the law, let's move forward, he interpreted it as absolute political validation. He immediately began framing the ruling as proof that every investigation into him was illegitimate, every indictment, every subpoena, every prosecution. He now calls them illegal, unconstitutional, deep state hoaxes, and then to prove his point, he went into the DOJ headquarters like it was the site of a campaign rally. Music, cameras, staff lined up like a staged photo op. If you thought the first Trump term blurred the line between government and personal loyalty, the second one has eliminated the line altogether.
And while that was happening publicly, something even more consequential was happening privately. The internal DOJ structure was being rebuilt from the inside out. Senior Justice Department officials who worked on Trump-related cases, January 6th, classified documents, the fake elector scheme, were pulled off their assignments. Not because they made mistakes, not because their work was flawed, but because their existence in the building was politically inconvenient. And it doesn't stop with a handful of prosecutors. Whole divisions are being reorganized. Teams that once had full caseloads are now being told to stand down. And some are even being told they'll be reassigned to compliance offices that literally have no operational mandate, because their real mission is to disappear the people working there. If this sounds extreme, it's because it is, and the reaction from Trump's legal allies proves it. They're not even pretending this is about justice. They're openly bragging that Trump's immunity ruling means he can pursue his agenda without interference. That's not the language of a functioning separation of powers. That's the language of a president who believes oversight doesn't apply to him anymore. And look, I get it. Politicians on both sides use hyperbole. But this isn't hyperbole. When you combine the immunity ruling, the purge within DOJ, and the immediate retaliation toward the people who worked on his cases, you get something we've simply never seen in modern American politics.
And then there's the part that genuinely shocked even veteran reporters, the return of the Mar-a-Lago boxes. Think about the signal that sends. The FBI executed a search warrant approved by a federal judge. They recovered highly classified records. A detailed indictment laid out obstruction, false statements, and deliberate efforts to conceal those documents. And now, under President Trump's second-term DOJ, those same boxes have been returned to him. You don't have to be a legal scholar to know what message that communicates to every employee at DOJ, FBI, DHS, DIA, CIA, or any other agency that handles classified information. It says the rules are optional for the president, and the consequences depend entirely on whether the courts feel like enforcing them. You can almost see the psychological shift happening inside the Justice Department. People who spent their careers believing that no one is above the law were hit with the clearest demonstration yet that actually someone is. And when they ask what happens next, the answer is even more unsettling, because Trump isn't just undoing past cases, he's authorizing new ones. Let's talk about the Miami investigation for a moment, because this isn't some routine audit or internal review. This is a full-blown criminal investigation targeting Obama-era and early Trump-era intelligence officials who helped produce the 2017 assessment that Russia interfered in the election to benefit Trump. This assessment has been confirmed repeatedly by Mueller, by Senate intelligence, by independent experts, by U.S. intelligence agencies across administrations. But now, Trump's Justice Department is issuing subpoenas to the very people who signed off on it. Brennan, Comey, former CIA analysts, former national security officials, names that have been on Trump's rhetorical hit list for years are suddenly on subpoena lists in real life. And the person running that effort is a Trump loyalist who has reorganized his office in a way that centralizes all politically sensitive cases under his direct control.
Okay, hold on. Let's be clear. Here's the part that really matters. And yeah, this is wild. You don't have to guess why that's happening. It's retaliation dressed up as oversight. And the people inside DOJ know exactly how dangerous that is. Because once you normalize criminal investigations into political opponents based on policy disagreements or intelligence findings, you're not running a Justice Department anymore. You're running a political enforcement unit. And here's the kicker. The Supreme Court's immunity ruling gives the president extraordinary protection for actions taken under the guise of official acts. So if Trump orders new investigations into people he considers political enemies, and he frames it as part of his official duties, good luck challenging that in court. The burden of proof is now on prosecutors to show an act was unofficial. And if there's one thing Trump understands, it's how to embed his personal agenda inside the framework of official duties. Let's also talk about the pardons again, because the downstream consequences are massive. When President Trump pardoned nearly 1,600 January 6 defendants, it sent a message not just to the people who stormed the Capitol, but to anyone who might consider similar actions in the future. The message wasn't subtle. Loyalty to the president comes with protection. That is the exact kind of precedent that future extremists, opportunists, and bad actors will use as justification. And prosecutors who spent years working on those cases have made it clear. This wasn't just demoralizing, it was destabilizing. They watched people convicted of violent offenses walk free because the president who inspired the attack in the first place decided accountability was optional.
And again, the people who are most alarmed by this aren't political commentators. They're the ones who spent thousands of hours reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, preparing cases, appearing before judges, and securing convictions. They're telling us what this moment means. And for once, they're not mincing words. They're saying the Justice Department has crossed into territory it was never meant to occupy. They're saying the practical ability to prosecute presidential wrongdoing has been gutted. They're saying the signal to future presidents is dangerous. Abuse your power early, embed your agenda inside official acts, and you might never be held accountable. And the most staggering part, we haven't even reached the full consequences yet. Because right now, the DOJ is reacting, but soon, it's going to start adapting. Departments adapt to rulings, they adjust their practices, they reinterpret risks, and that means fewer investigations into presidential misconduct, fewer attempts to challenge executive overreach, more hesitation, more fear, more paralysis. And if you're a president who already sees the justice system as a tool rather than a safeguard, that's exactly what you want. And that brings us to the next phase of this unraveling. One that almost nobody anticipated, but one that is already happening quietly, behind the scenes, in ways that are far more dangerous than anything we've discussed so far.
And here's the part that almost no one is talking about, but absolutely should be, the long-term consequences for the rule of law. Because while everyone's focused on the immediate fallout, the collapse of Jack Smith's cases, the DOJ purge, the mass pardons, the real danger is what this moment establishes as a permanent precedent. If a president can undermine investigations into himself, fire or sideline the people who conducted them, reorder the justice system to serve personal interests, and then claim immunity for any official act, then the presidency stops being a constitutional office and starts being a personal shield. And no democracy survives that shift for long. This isn't hyperbole. This is the direct result of a Supreme Court ruling that essentially says if a president can plausibly argue that an action is connected to his official duties, then courts must assume immunity unless proven otherwise. And the people who understand how severe that is aren't cable news panels. They're the former federal prosecutors who spent their careers inside this system. They're the ones saying if this is the new standard, presidents can direct law enforcement to target enemies and protect allies, and prosecutors will have almost no recourse. That's not speculation. That's the DOJ's own concern. Quiet, but real.
And they're asking questions that should scare everyone. Like, if a president orders an investigation into a political opponent and claims it's part of a national security review, is that an official act? Under this ruling, maybe. If a president pressures state officials to change election results and frames it as part of his constitutional role to ensure the integrity of elections, is that an official act? Under this ruling, possibly. And if a president uses the powers of the executive branch to retaliate against critics, say by reshuffling agencies, removing oversight roles, or launching criminal investigations, can prosecutors challenge that? Good luck. The Supreme Court has now handed presidents the ability to argue immunity at every turn, and the DOJ isn't equipped for that. Not structurally, not culturally. Under normal circumstances, the Justice Department operates under the assumption that prosecutors can pursue evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads to the Oval Office. That doesn't mean cases are easy, but it means they're possible. This ruling didn't make them difficult. It made them structurally nearly impossible. It built a legal barrier around the presidency that requires prosecutors to scale a wall that didn't exist before, and in some cases, may not be scalable at all. And that's where the panic you're hearing about internally makes complete sense. Because the DOJ isn't panicking about losing one case. They're panicking about losing jurisdiction, about losing authority, about losing the ability to enforce the law at the highest level of government. They're asking, what do we do if the president does something illegal and the courts say we can't even investigate it? And right now, nobody has an answer.
But here's where it gets even more disturbing. The signal this sends internationally. Democracies around the world have relied on the idea that the United States, whatever its flaws, has a functioning rule of law. Presidents get investigated. Presidents get subpoenaed. Presidents get questioned. Presidents, in extreme cases, get charged. And the U.S. has held that line for decades, through Watergate, through Iran-Contra, through Clinton's impeachment, through Trump's first and second impeachments. Now, the highest court in the land just told the world that the U.S. president is effectively beyond criminal accountability for official acts. And it's not just foreign leaders who notice that shift. It's authoritarian regimes who now see a window to justify their own abuses. If the U.S. can shield its leader from prosecution for acts tied to official duties, why can't they? If the U.S. can pardon violent rioters who attacked its own capital, why can't they pardon dissidents who acted in their favor? If the U.S. lets a president retaliate against investigators, why can't they call their own purges administrative restructuring? The point here isn't that the U.S. was perfect. It wasn't. But the guardrails that existed, even if imperfect, sent a message about democratic norms. Those guardrails are now in pieces, and the people inside DOJ understand exactly how far-reaching this is. They've watched the institution that was supposed to hold the line dissolve under political pressure. They've seen cases evaporate, evidence returned, investigators reassigned, and leadership replaced with loyalists whose qualifications are secondary to obedience. And when they look at that landscape, they're not just worried about what Trump is doing now, they're worried about what future presidents will do with the power the Supreme Court just codified.
And the clearest warning sign is the public silence. You don't hear DOJ leadership speaking out. You don't hear FBI leadership pushing back. And that silence isn't agreement, it's fear. Fear of retaliation, fear of losing their jobs, fear that the tools needed to push back have been stripped away, fear that the system itself won't protect them. Because right now, it won't. The immunity ruling didn't just protect Trump from prosecution, it created a chilling effect throughout the executive branch. If you cross the president, you might not just lose your position, you might find yourself under investigation. And that brings us back to Jack Smith. Think about what his experience represents. Here's a prosecutor who built one of the most meticulously documented cases in modern history. Eyewitnesses, surveillance footage, audio recordings, classified documents recovered by agents, intent evidence, obstruction evidence, everything prosecutors dream of having in a high-profile case. And it didn't matter. Because once the immunity ruling landed and Cannon pounced on it, the case was effectively over. Not because the facts were flawed, but because the presidency had been elevated above accountability. The message to every prosecutor watching was unmistakable. If you take on a president, even with overwhelming evidence, you can still lose. Not on the facts, but on the rules. And if the rules protect the president more than the law does, the entire purpose of accountability collapses.
And here's the tragic irony. The DOJ now faces a future where it is institutionally less capable of investigating the presidency than any point in modern history. And the person who benefits from that is already demonstrating exactly how far he's willing to push it. Trump isn't hiding his intentions. He's not being subtle. He's telling supporters in plain language that he's going after people who wronged him, that he's cleaning out the corrupt deep state, that he's restoring justice. And his allies inside the DOJ? They're doing exactly that, except their definition of justice is whatever aligns with Trump's political goals. This isn't theoretical concern. This is happening in real time. Subpoenas targeting officials who investigated Russian interference, investigations launched into former intelligence leaders, pardons granted to violent rioters, evidence returned to the person it was seized from, prosecutors reassigned to meaningless offices, senior FBI leaders forced out. All of this in the span of months. So the question now, the one every DOJ official, every judge, every journalist, and frankly every voter should be asking is, how far does this go? Because we're not watching a temporary shift. We're watching the structural transformation of the justice system under a president who now knows he can carry out official acts with a level of legal protection no modern president has ever had. And if this administration is already going this far this quickly, imagine what the next 3 years look like. We're looking at a future where the only real check on presidential power isn't the courts anymore. It's elections. And when one party is openly embracing election denial, purging internal oversight, and granting mass pardons to political allies, even that check becomes weaker.
That's the problem. This is not normal. Let's be clear. Here's the part that really matters. And yeah, this is wild. That's why the panic at DOJ matters. It's not emotional, it's analytical. It's the realization that once a president no longer fears legal consequences for official acts, the only barrier left is whether he wants to restrain himself. And President Trump has made it very clear that restraint is not part of his governing philosophy. And that, more than anything else, is the story unfolding right now. Because for the first time in modern history, the Justice Department is facing a president whose power has been fortified by the very court designed to limit it. And if you think the fallout has already peaked, I promise you it hasn't.